Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm back once again at Aimpoint headquarters in Malmo, Sweden, taking a look at the evolution of the US M68 Close Combat Optic, aka the Aimpoint CompM, M2, M3, and M4 series. So in the mid-1990s, the US Army started a large-scale formal trial to adopt probably a red dot optic. I suppose it probably could have been a holographic optic had a holographic site won the trials, but they started a large competitive trial for a non-magnified close combat optic. And Aimpoint was one of the finalists. Actually, well, Aimpoint won the trial, of course. The other finalists at the end, by the way, were Trijicon and Meprolite. And Aimpoint apparently didn't actually expect to win because they're a Swedish company and they just kind of figured that the nod would go to Trijicon as an American company. But Aimpoint ended up winning this competition in August of 1997 on both the technical merits and the cost of their option, which was the Aimpoint CompM. So this began as a development from the Aimpoint 5000, and let's just dive right in and let me show you the original CompM and how it has evolved over the years. The story of the CompM actually begins with the Aimpoint 5000. So there were some practical pistol shooters in the US who were starting to use Aimpoints on frame mounts on handguns for IPSC type competition shooting. Now, this tube is designed to be mounted on a rifle, and so it's set up to have two independent ring mounts. But the back section of this tube is completely hollow. Like, there's nothing down in there for this whole segment. It's just there as a mounting point. Well, some of the practical pistol shooters using these realized they don't actually need two rings, they just need one ring up here. They can just remove this section of the tube entirely and have a more compact optic. So they started doing that. Aimpoint noticed it and started making a version specifically like that, and that was the Aimpoint Comp, for competition or compact. Apparently stands for kind of both, either, take your pick. Now, when the US military puts out its request for a close combat optic, Aimpoint takes the Comp and starts making a number of modifications to it to set it up specifically for military requirements. So this is already a fairly rugged optic design, but they need to add some features to it. So they add flip down lens covers, front and back. They add retention wire here for the battery cap and the zeroing, the elevation and windage cover knobs, so that, you know, of course, on one of these guys, you take this cap off and then it's just loose, and if you drop it, well, it's gone unless you find where you dropped it. Not a great thing for the military, where they're certainly going to be dropping and losing caps left and right. More fundamentally, the optic had to be compatible with night vision use, which means you need two separate things. One, you need power settings that are a lot lower than normal daytime use, because of course in night vision you're magnifying the available light, you're amplifying the available light, and so a regular brightness dot is going to just completely blow out in night vision. So that's fairly easy to do. The biggest technical challenge was the coating on the reflective lens at the front of the optic. So the way a red dot sight works, and by the way, I have a whole video on how a collimated red dot sight works if you want all the details, but you've got a red LED that's sending light up to this lens and then bouncing it back down the length of the tube. This lens has to do two things at once. It has to reflect that red light from the LED. That's what actually gives you a reticle that you can see, but it also has to allow light through so that, well, you can see the target through the optic. Now, the way they do that is with a special coating on the lens that's designed to reflect specifically the wavelengths of the LED that's being used while minimizing the disruption of light coming through from the front end. Now, to work in night vision, you actually have a different range of light frequency that you have to be able to see. So where a daytime version of this optic for, say, competition shooting, in the infrared spectrum, you don't care if it actually allows light to transmit through, because No one's shooting IPSC through night vision goggles. For the military, however, you have to have a coating that is both has maximum transparency in the visible spectrum and also in the infrared spectrum. So what would become the CompM military pattern has that night vision compatible coating. So in August of 1997, Aimpoint is formally awarded a contract for the CompM under the designation M68 Close Combat Optic. I should point out, at this point, this was still their early generation LED technology, so it's using 1/3N batteries, a single 1/3N battery, and it had a couple hundred hours of battery life, depending on the brightness setting that it was set at. Aimpoint gets an order for 100,000 of these optics over the course of 3 years, and this was a seismic order for the company. At this point, they had 3 or 4 people working in the assembly department. They were making 10 or 12,000 optics per year in total, and now they've got a contract for 10 times that annual production. So the company had to scale up rapidly, and in that first year, 97 to 98, they scaled up from like 3 people, 4 people in production to 40 or 50 people in the production department. And frankly, it is not a trivial accomplishment that they were able to scale up like that successfully without having massive quality problems or other problems. That's one of those things where on the surface it looks like just a huge gold mine for a company, but it is scaling up like that can be a process seriously fraught with danger. Anyway, Aimpoint was able to navigate that process successfully. Very shortly after this adoption, they developed an improved LED technology, which on the civilian market was called the XD. This scaled up their battery life from a few hundred hours to about 1,000 hours. And in the middle of production of the original CompM M68s, they switched from the early LED to that XD LED technology without any, there's no obvious changes to the outside of the system, just the later production ones had the better LED and better battery life. All right, I also want to touch briefly on this ring mount here. This was provided to Aimpoint in sort of a general form by Picatinny Arsenal in the US, and Aimpoint then finalized it. It's a single clamp to go onto a Picatinny rail, but instead of being tightenable to however strong your wrench is, it includes this spring-loaded thumb wheel. So you can only tighten it this tight, and then instead of getting tighter, it just snaps over here. And this is a really good idea for a military optic because it prevents Private Bubba, who weighs 300 pounds and can bench press a tank, from taking a wrench to his optics mount and crushing the receiver when he's trying to make sure that the optic doesn't come loose. So I kind of like this system. It's you don't have to worry about whether the optic's actually tight enough. You don't need a torque wrench. You just tighten it until it snaps like that. All right, as the US Army starts to deploy the CompM with units and they start seeing field use, there are a number of shortcomings that become evident. And this leads to Aimpoint developing the CompM2, second generation of the system, developing it in 1999 or so and launching it in 2000. And this essentially maintains the same designation as M68 CCO and takes over from production of the original version. So what does our CompM2 add to the original system? Well, first off, we have a rubber strap here replacing the original wire retaining system. The problem is those wires got caught on stuff. You can see how that could very easily happen. Wires get in the way. This is a nice low-profile rubber strap. More importantly, this has been redesigned to be substantially more rugged. So on the original Aimpoint 5000, and that carries over to the original Comp, you have a housing here, and then you have an inner tube into which the LED and the lens are mounted. And on this, the inner tube is actually on the outside at the front. So this piece is what's being shifted around when you zero the optic, and it's separate from this piece back here. That means if you push on this, you can actually move the zero, and this is something you can potentially damage. If this scope takes a significant impact to this front section, well, that can damage it. With the M2, they redesign it so that the main outer body housing extends the full length of the scope, and the inner tube is now entirely inside that body tube. So this is recognizable on the outside by the depth of this groove here. On the later ones, it's just sort of an aesthetic groove that I think is in there to set location on the ring that mounts the inner tube. Here, you can see that they're clearly two separate pieces. So on the M2, you've got that ruggedized feature. They also, at this point, introduce, for the first time, hard anodizing. This is a technology that was still in development at the time, and with the early M2s, they still weren't able to actually anodize true black. So they went with like deep slate gray instead, which was as close as they could get to black at the time, but the hard anodizing was a much more durable surface finish than had been used, the just plain anodizing on the earlier model. As far as the electronics go, the M2 was from the very beginning using that XD improved LED battery electronic system. So this is going to have about 1,000 hours of battery life, depending on the power setting. And it is a 4-minute of angle dot, as was the original CompM. So beginning in 2000, new US Army M68 CCOs are Aimpoint CompM2s. And that's going great. They are being produced in significant numbers. Just as a quick aside, there's also a law enforcement and a civilian version of the Comp Model 2. So the M2 is military, the ML2 is the law enforcement version, which is essentially the same as this, but without the night vision capacity, both the power settings and the lens coating. And then there is the Comp C2, which is the civilian competition version, which does not have the night vision settings and just has a standard anodize instead of the hard anodize. Now, we'll touch on the Aimpoint CompM3 here for a moment because, well, it is the next one in the numeric series, but there's not that much to say about it. The M3 is just an M2 with a ruggedized rubber housing on it. And frankly, the rubber housing is really more for aesthetics than it is for anything else. This is essentially a product of the marketing department instead of a product of the engineering department. And not surprisingly, as such, it wasn't particularly popular. It didn't make all that much impact. This rubber housing was available in both black and coyote sand color. This is during that time period, roughly 2004, where there's a big push for desert colored equipment. So that was an option. Unfortunately, I don't have one of the sand ones here to show you, but the M3 is just an M2 with a rubber cover on it. But you can see here, it is marked CompM3. And this, by the way, changes down to a 2-minute of angle dot. All right, now back to the engineering developments. While they're happily making CompM2s for the US Army, Aimpoint is also developing the Comp CS for the Swedish Army. And the Swedes demanded a 10-year constant on battery life. And Aimpoint was able to do that by giving it a AA battery, which in this case is actually hardwired into the optic and cannot be removed. That was actually a request of the Swedish procurement. They did not want soldiers to be able to take the battery out of the optics. Well, the US hears about this 10-year battery life thing and go, yeah, we would also like that, please. And so the result is the CompM4. There is now a AA sized battery housing up here. However, it is a removable, replaceable battery. The US Army is not interested in having to send its optics back to Malmo, Sweden to have their batteries replaced. Not a big deal. It is interesting, the CS was not a proprietary battery, it was just a AA battery hardwired into the optics. So making it with a removable battery is not a big deal. This is then also ruggedized in a number of other ways beyond what they had with the CompM2. So the zeroing turrets have been made lower profile. They've got these protective blocks around them. The ring mount is gone. They've replaced that with a clamp on their own sort of proprietary attachment rail right here, but the idea is we're not designing optics around hunting rifles anymore that need traditional scope style rings. No, we're making optics that are all going to go on Picatinny rail on AR-15s or other military rifles. So why sacrifice anything to having, you know, traditional scope rings? Instead, we'll just make this mounting base, and then if you need it higher, you can add whatever sort of spacer you want in there. They increased the clamping force on the attachment and gave it a bigger thumb wheel knob to go along with it, but it's the same style of system. This is your torque limiter, so you tighten it down until it's tight and clicks over, and it's kind of like a self-tightening gas cap on your car that way. So Private Buff Snuffy is not going to destroy his optic or his rifle trying to mount it effectively. One of the other things they changed here that doesn't sound like a big deal but actually was relevant is the mechanics of the power knob here. So by far the most common problem, in fact virtually the only real problem that they had with CompMs and CompM2s, was this power knob breaking. The knob is on the actual spindle connected to the internals of the electronics, and if this takes a significant impact, it will break the whole system, and then the scope has to be replaced or repaired. What they've done here is essentially detach the knob from the actual spindle inside. So it has a little bit of play now before it actually engages. There's a click. Click, 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 but then we've got this bit of play in there. That bit of play is indicative of the knob being separate from the internal components. So if this gets hit hard enough to break it, the knob will pop off, but the internal components will remain intact. The knob can be easily replaced, and the scope can remain in service. So that was really the one failure point that still existed on the M2, and they fixed it on the M4. And other than that, it is the same internal construction. It's actually, I think, basically the exact same internal tube construction, just with a different battery pack. It is worth pointing out here, on the Aimpoint CS, that battery pack was set at the bottom to keep it out of the shooter's field of view. When the Army looked at these, they said they wanted the battery pack on top so that it was in the same position as on the M2, the idea of if you're using your left hand to turn the thing on or off, it's more convenient to have it up high. However, after a couple years of procurement, and by the way, this was first adopted in 2005 by the US Army, after a couple of years, they started accepting low battery compartment versions as well, because you know what, it really isn't that big a deal if the battery compartment is high or low, and having it low does, in fact, keep it out of the way of the shooter's field of vision a little bit better. That 10,000 hour battery life comes not just from having a AA battery, which is substantially larger, has more energy than in the 1/3N batteries in the previous versions of the Optic. It also comes from an improved LED technology that is more power efficient. The lens cover adopted for the M4 is a two-part affair. So if you just pop up the top lens, you have a kill flash built in. This is so that the lens doesn't reflect potentially visible to an enemy downrange. You can then also lift it up using these tabs, which give you the full, the regular lens exposed. This you would want to use at night so that you don't lose the light transmission that the kill flash takes up. So the kill flash is a compromise. It doesn't reflect, but it also doesn't let through as much light. It was the Model 3000 that first brought Aimpoint to the attention of the military in the form of special operations soldiers essentially privately procuring the optics for their own use. But it was the Aimpoint CompM that solidified the company as a huge player in modern military optical sights. Of course, from the CompM all the way through, well, we have the CompM4 here, but we also have the CompM5 that has been developed subsequently, and Aimpoint, of course, remains one of the biggest, if not the biggest, players in high-end military red dot optics. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this look at the history and development of the CompM series. A big thanks again to Aimpoint for giving me access to these to show to you guys. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.